Hello, my name is Maria McNamara, and today I'm joined by Professor John Blaxland and Gus McLaughlin from Bondi Partners. We're going to have the Q&A session that we didn't have time to fit into the Future Work Summit. And what I want to do is hone in on the changes that we've seen in this brief period since the summit, particularly in Ukraine. Thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you, Maria.
A lot seems to happen in a very short time, Maria. So we could almost, give our presentations again and not cover the same ground.
Yeah. It's quite remarkable. John, I might just ask you both to do that, not the whole presentation, but to hit issues that you think need to be raised in light of all the changes. John, I might ask you to start first.
Yeah, so obviously the two big ones for us are, in my view, recently is what's happened obviously in Ukraine and the ongoing saga there, and also what's happened in the Solomon Islands. Just on Ukraine first, clearly this is taking a lot longer for Vladimir Putin to achieve his objectives. I don't think he's given up on his objectives of removing the Zelensky government. I think he's still trying to do that, and I think we can't be too cavalier about how long this is going to take and how much pain is going to be imposed on the people of Ukraine. This is a president who really doesn't give a damn about the cost. He's quite prepared to have a lot of people experience a lot of pain to get what he wants. The question now is, I think, how much Western resolve there is, and whether or not the sanctions are going to bite sufficiently, and whether or not we can continue to maintain the resolve to keep the Ukrainian forces equipped and resourced to do the job which I think, and Gus may well agree with me, has changed. We saw the construction of Molotov cocktails in the early days. We're now seeing the Russian forces much more long-range, multiple launch rocket systems, long-range artillery, staying away from having their tanks fight in the streets where they're vulnerable for people actually dropping things on top of them and firing the anti-tank guided weapons at closer range. That seems to be the way they're going forward. My sense is that they've got the capacity there, even though it might take some time to muster that from across Russia. They've got the resources, and with the will, which I think still is there, they've got the resources to press. So my sense is the negotiations we've been seeing in Turkey, for instance, are really about a smokescreen about trying to get more concessions from Zelensky. I'm not optimistic that this is going to end well yet. And I still think that the Finland scenario of early 1940, after the Winter War, where Finland effectively faced a very significant onslaught from Russia, but bloodied them enough where the Russians thought, well, we don't really need to go fully into Finland, and we can't topple the government easily, so let's get them to be neutral and to concede on the territory. Now, that lasted for a couple of years. Whether or not it's a model that'll work in Ukraine is another matter. Just flipping to the other side, and I'm sure Gus will add more on this too. While we've been focused a little bit on Ukraine, we have a tendency to not walk and chew gum very well.
Yeah.
And that's certainly the case what we're seeing in the Solomon Islands, where despite more than 20 years of us investing in our relationship with Solomon Islands, bolstering the security forces, supporting the government, and for many years backing Sogavari himself, we see, I think, is what is a slap in the face to Australia, as well as to New Zealand, Papua New Guinea and Fiji and others. But not only is that a slap in the face to us, I think it's a very dangerous move in terms of introducing a culturally remote player into the Pacific. It's not part of the family. We're not part of we don't have very much in common there. But also there's a real risk of civil war inside Guadalcanal and between Guadalcanal and Malaita, the two most populated islands. The governor of Malaita is very clearly pro-Taiwan. People of Malaita are clearly on edge and agitated. This move by Sogavari, I suspect, will make things worse. So watch this space. Solomon Islands may well revert to the kind of crisis we faced back in 2003, sadly.
There's a great deal in that. Let's start with Ukraine and then move across to the Solomon Islands. Gus, what's happening strategically and practically in war fighting now in Ukraine? As you know, we've observed, they haven't been able to achieve the objectives that we all thought were in play, and NATO has been able to get weapons across to Ukraine to see a blunting of that approach. What are we seeing now?
Yeah, unfortunately, I share some of John's ongoing concerns. We're seeing lots of very positive imagery, communications, and some fantastic strategic leadership from President Zelensky. But to some extent, that's giving us a little bit of a rose-coloured glasses view of the conflict. We've now reached a point where Russia's at its most dangerous. And John very succinctly described this phase where they just sort of hold the Ukrainians at bay and use these rockets and artillery to level whole cities. And Putin's mindset would be, well, if I can't win terrain, I'm going to at least be feared. And I think, you know, he's more akin to a mafioso leader than a traditional state leader as we would understand it. So there's some tough days ahead for the Ukraine. We have a lot to learn about what's happened already. I think the fact that Ukraine has been able to behave so effectively and coherently is a lesson for all countries, including Australia, and that is to give the world time to organise itself, create sanctions, rally around, provide assistance in the form of precision weapons and the like. You have to be resilient enough and cohesive enough and well led to survive any initial periods of turbulence. So I think there's a new phase for all nations to understand what national resilience means. And it was no surprise in our defence budget to see defence spending increase and significantly the announcement of the increase in cyber capability. And I think John and I have both commented publicly that sort of announcement's easy. Another thing is to grow, potentially up to 1,900 or 2,000 new, cyber warriors in the coming years. But I think that domain, we knew it would be important. We thought Russia might be decisive, and the ability of the West to rally around the Ukrainian state capabilities, which are already sophisticated. The head of GCHQ is in Australia and speaking today, and he's commented on the fact that his agency and a number of others, including the Australian Signals Directorate, have helped preserve the Ukraine's ability to communicate to the world and also to command and control their own forces. So those capabilities are essential now for nation states to survive. The number of these anti-tank guided weapons that have gone into the Ukraine, we're hearing something like 500 a day being fired. I wouldn't be surprised if we had no more than a few thousand of those in stock holdings in Australia completely. So, if we're going to start to learn what it takes to stop the forces of either a superpower or an emerging superpower, we've got to understand, what's involved. And so I think there's a number of observations there. I agree with John's assessment completely about the impact of Ukraine on us, and it is on one level, of course, it's an attack on our Western value system and the rule of law. But it's also very much being run as a test case of Western resolve for President Xi Jinping in China. We know he's actively supporting Russia. He's allowed the release of a Russian formation to move from the border between Russia and China, where it was during security duties, all the way west to be involved in the conflict some 4,000 kilometres away. So Putin would not be able to take those liberties with his security forces if he didn't have some very firm undertaking from President Xi. So this is a global conflict being watched very closely by a key leader in our region.
Can I just ask one question in terms of the forces in Ukraine? The Russians have deeper resources. How do you maintain the momentum in Ukraine when the people fighting? There must be limits that are reached.
Yeah, look, I forecast at the start that Russia didn't have the combat forces or what we call the force ratios to do much more than effectively sort of annex some of the east, possibly the Black Sea coast, and attempt for regime change. So I'm not surprised that they've culminated about where they have. I think what the Ukraine military has been able to achieve is to preserve so far Kiev and the centre of government, and so far prevented the loss of Odessa on the Black Sea coast. So with the, and we have a thing in military we call mathematics. The realities of force ratios matter. So the Ukrainians have got an effective defensive capability, and the defence is the easier part of war. Now, I'm not trivialising it when I use the term easier, but often we will expect a defensive force to stop an attacker that is 3 times its size, sometimes even 5 times its size. So we're seeing that play out in the Ukraine. But there's no question Putin received very poor intelligence. He's got leaders who weren't willing to tell him honestly the likely resistance. So we're seeing a lot more Russian frustration than perhaps they expected. But the challenge for the Ukraine is every one of those brave engagements where some soldiers pop up and fire an anti-tank guided missile at a Russian column, they're usually losing soldiers themselves. Now, they might inflict 5 or 10 casualties, but they might lose 1 or 2 soldiers themselves. So this is a war of attrition on both sides. And like John, I fear that Putin will pretend to negotiate. He will rest and reconsolidate his forces, wait for the ground to dry out. The mud has been a very significant factor. And once that ground dries out and Russian vehicles can move away from the roads across fields and things, they'll be a much harder force to contain. So there's unfortunately much more of this to come.
So, John and Gus, what's the West's response? What's NATO's response? What is our will, and how do we extricate the world from this crisis? This can't be another Syria. I think you're on mute, John.
Sadly, I think it can, Maria. I think it can be another Syria. It's not that unlike Grozny in the Chechen War. Russia has a long track record, a great pedigree of razing cities to the ground. And in this case, the stakes are pretty high. Putin's put his whole reputation in on this, and he doesn't think he can afford to lose, and doesn't feel he can compromise. He's by painting it, continuing to paint it in terms of denazification, he's still talking about regime change. So they're the stakes that he's still talking about. He hasn't backed off that rhetoric. And if he was thinking about maybe coming to a compromise, in these purported peace negotiations in Turkey, then you would have thought that they'd stop talking that way, and they haven't. So I'm worried that's still the case. In terms of what we do now, it appears that the threshold that the West, NATO, is perceiving as below which they have to operate is manned or a human-operated aircraft. That can't do that. But UAVs are good, and we're obviously seeing some effects of that. My concern is that Russia has quite long range. One of their missile systems, an MLRS system they have, is capable of firing it up to 90 kilometres away. Now, I don't know how big their weapon, the stocks are of ammunition for that, but if they have that in substantial quantity, that means that they can operate at quite a long way away, probably beyond the range of most of the UAVs. And that, I think, that generates a need for us to be looking to support them with longer range UAV, more robust UAV capabilities to actually reach the MLRS systems and take them out of the equation. So that's, I think, where we're going. That's in addition to the ongoing resolve and resistance in the cities to fight any kind of thrust from any of the ground forces that might be used to accompany those bombardments. I welcome Gus's views on this too.
No, look, I support everything John said. I think, Maria, one of the things we need to understand, though, there is an extraordinary sharing of intelligence that's going on in the background. So the Ukrainian leadership will be incredibly well informed about the disposition of Russian forces through, satellite imagery and drone footage, as John has said. I think the West is using intelligence in a really important new way, and that is the preemption of Russian actions by disclosing information that the West has gathered. We've seen in the past people like John, my good friend, always very cautious about the need to preserve sources and protect where intelligence comes from, and that is important. But in this case, there's a fairly bold and assertive use of intelligence to preempt what Putin's doing. So I think that is new, and I hope it continues, because we tend to fight in the West with one arm tied behind our back in the information sphere, because we always usually only try and comment when we know something to be a fact, whereas our adversary isn't terribly worried about facts. I think this preemption of information is an important domain. We talked in other forums about the global hacktivism that is making life for Russia very difficult, and some of that's highly effective, and including right up to top level corporate. Microsoft pushing out patches at an accelerated rate to preserve Ukraine government ability to defend itself. Smaller companies going on the offense for both just for publicity or to at least get the story to the people of Russia, but and a lot in between of very disruptive actions. So Russia has been on the offensive cyber end in previous conflicts, and I think is probably feeling quite exposed to offensive cyber itself. And as we look at what that means for Australia, it clearly points to the background behind some of the government decisions that have been announced. We're a small nation, but if we can build up our capability in those domains, we make ourselves much pricklier in terms of anyone who might want to influence us.
So I'll ask one more question in relation to Ukraine, and then we'll come back to our region. Over 10 million Ukrainians have dispersed across Europe, and Europe is also hosting the Syrians. It's hosting, it's dealing with refugees out of Africa. How much can Europe bear before that starts to become the issue?
So yeah, look, I suspect, Maria, it's already starting to become the issue. There's indications that the generosity of spirit that people have displayed in hope bringing people into their own homes has been, in the anticipation that this is a very temporary measure. I don't think it is all that temporary. I think it'll be long term, and there really aren't that many other places for them to go. So this is going to take a monumental effort by the Western countries, particularly of Europe, to come up with a plan. And a lot of it depends on what actually happens in the war. Are these people going to be able to go back? I mean, let's not forget, in the previous Russian endeavors in the Cold War against Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they generated a major diaspora. Australia's been the beneficiary of that. We have many great Hungarian descendant and Czechoslovakian descended people who have become fantastic contributors to Australian society. And we should be looking to welcome more of them. And I know there's plans to do that, but I think this is big. This is very, very big. The last time we did something on this scale, or the scale that I envisage us probably having to do something in support, was when we had the Vietnamese refugees come to Australia, 40 plus years ago now. And I think that's the moment.
Yeah, look, I echo John's thoughts. I think we've all got to be responsible in our commentary about this. This is in a kind of television now culture. We've all got this view that Ukraine's winning, the war will be over, and these people will get to come home. As John said, at best, we're going to see the Russians resume the offensive when the ground dries. We'll still be talking about this at Christmas, and then potentially we're looking at a multi-year insurgency. So we are harming both Ukraine and these people by just sort of putting this in the bucket to say that these people are all being welcomed, and there's people driving down from as far as Scandinavia to pick them up at the border with Poland and take them home. That's all wonderful human reaction, but for us in the leadership domain, we have to understand this is 10 million displaced people who will be displaced for at least a couple of years and possibly longer. So I think it's now starting to think about what are the long-term implications for Europe and for other, like-minded liberal democracies.
Well, what it does do is when we're talking about refugees, it's clearly Australia has a position on all of that, but we are welcoming refugees coming out of Ukraine. You mentioned, John, the situation in the Solomon Islands, and that's in addition to the Belt and Road Initiative has been going on for quite a while, and you've got, the tensions in Taiwan. And let's just have a look at this region, but let's focus on the Solomons. How did we allow it to get to this position? Or if we didn't allow it, how did it get to this position? It seems quite breathtaking that the relationship between the Solomon Islands and China was moving in this direction, and we missed it.
It is breathtaking, Maria. Look, I think Australia sometimes it's a middle power, but it's got small power pretensions, and we kind of don't rise to the occasion very well. We don't see our role in a benefactor role. It's in sufficiently broad terms, and sometimes we shy away from engagement on reconstruction, rehabilitation, and some thorny issues that are difficult to address with neighbours, but which are actually, I think, in their interests and our shared interests. And what we have in the Solomon Islands is a situation that we kind of patched over, but didn't really help resolve. The ADF contributed with Ramsey, the Regional Assistance Mission Solomon Islands, from 2003 onwards, and we were involved before then as well. But really, without seeking to drive a reform, institutional reform at the senior level. And I'm concerned that what we have now is a situation where the schism in Malaysia, Solomon Islands society is perhaps, if anything, deepening. And we've seen the governor of Malaita, the island, the principal island north of Guadalcanal. A lot of people from Malaita live on Guadalcanal, where Honiara is based, and there's a high level of discontent. And we have, I think, in fact, at times contributed to that by coming in, ironically, backing Sogavari like we did in November, coming in and trying to calm the storm, rather than actually addressing the root causes of the storm. And that's festered, and now it's blown up in our faces because the government we supported is now kind of almost not quite spurning us, but rejecting our advice, acting in a way that we have demonstrably made very clear we don't see as in our interests, and we don't see as being in their interests either. We see this as harmful to their interests, particularly because of the effect this will have in terms of further deepening a schism in Solomon Island society. It's a very difficult situation, but I do think we need to be looking to re-engage. Because there's a great line from Alice in Wonderland: if that's where you wanted to go, I wouldn't start from here. But we are where we are. We can't undo what's happened. We have to go forward from here. And what I think is really needed is a really respectful, constructive, visionary engagement with the future. And one of the things that, others have come up with this idea before me, Kevin Rudd amongst them, but I've been advocating for a grand compact for the Pacific. Now, initially, I was thinking of this as being something that's more suitable for the smaller microstates like Kiribati, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Nauru. But I think it could apply to Solomon Islands to a certain extent as well, where we actually offer them a deal where they have residency rights and potentially citizenship to come to Australia, with a reciprocal offer of us engaging to assist them with the protection of their exclusive economic zone, but also helping them with some governance concerns. A lot of these states don't have proper governance mechanisms. We take for granted our audit and inspector general functions, the separation of the judiciary from the executive, and professional, robustly institutionalized police and security elements. That's a lot harder to sustain in a microstate. And I don't think, have acted with sufficient farsightedness or generosity of spirit in our approach. And part of the reason is we're seen in a cynical way as being fair weather, kind of hot and cold on issues and too focused on China. So we haven't been addressing felt needs concerning climate. And we see the issues of governance. And I know in my SWOT analysis, I talked about, great power contestation, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance challenges. Well, the governance challenges are growing, and in microstates, they're accentuated by the great power contestation and by the environmental challenges as well. And we, I think, as a nation, are well postured to assist, to render respectful, collegial support, not haughty, patronising support, but respectful and collegial support. We can do that. We haven't yet risen to that occasion.
Maria, I might just
Please
amplify.
do.
I might just amplify a couple of points John made. I think the strategic observations he makes are profoundly important. I think it's also worth noting that we can't solve these problems militarily. We have a very small military. And, I was an operational leader in the Army at the time. We had to withdraw regular forces from the Solomon Islands because the government had committed us to both Iraq and Afghanistan. We were in 3 conflicts at the same time. We started to replace regular forces with reserve forces. And then, in the end, ultimately, we ran out of the ability to sustain that operation. So these are not problems that can be solved with a very small military. Now, I note the government again's given an undertaking to increase the size of the army. One of the problems we're having trouble sustaining the army we've got in terms of, fierce opposition, other forms of employment, different aspirations for young people, and the fact that the military's been heavily stretched as a disaster release force and carrying people's bags at the airport who've returned to Australia during the COVID emergency. So we've got some decisions we need to make as a nation about the size and shape of our military and what it does. What does the reserve force do? And in fact, is there a need for a paid volunteer emergency force, perhaps a national equivalent of the state emergency services and so on? They're all important conversations that I feel we need to have. Our climate emergency is not temporary. It was bushfires, now it's flood. Sydney seeing record rainfall that relates to changes to the ocean temperature. These are not transitory. So we're not going to be able to solve tomorrow's problems with the same organisational construct that we solved yesterday's problems with. And that Solomon Island situation is a classic example of we ran out of strategic patience with the organisational capacity we had, and as a result, we hadn't solved the problem. And arguably, the West has made the same failure in Afghanistan and other places. So, these are not problems you can solve with the same tools you might have used 10 years ago.
So it seems as though we've now woken up to a world that has always, or that has been marching towards this position, but Ukraine has lifted the Band-Aid and made us face into some really complex issues. Complex issues of, shifts in power, complex issues in terms of new alignments and whatnot. And for the first time in my lifetime, I'm actually asking the questions. I'm asking what the plan B is. John, you alluded to the fact that we now needed one. So, for the young, do we need to start thinking about a year 13, for example, picking up your point, Gus? Do they need to do some form of service so that if we do need to ready ourselves, at least there's the basic training that's required to pull the community together? We've got the budget making investments in cyber. Do we need to now, as businesses, as the business community, work more collaboratively with government in that space to ensure that the skills are transferable? It's more, I guess the question I'm asking is, do we now need to pull together as a nation to prepare ourselves in light of what could be, because that risk is higher now?
Yeah, so I think you're right, Maria. We need to step up. We've been in a bit of a twilight zone. We've been living through the unipolar moment and enjoying the benefits of that with a boutique defence force that we didn't feel needed to grow because it was excellent. It did its job. Everything we asked of it, it did. And we're now at the point, I actually think we're almost breaking the defence force. The operational tempo is, the operational tempo, the training tempo of the Defence Force is high when you don't throw in all these other things on top. Because it's a boutique defence force, it's a small one, we ask a lot of it. So it's very, very capable, but to maintain that level of capability takes a lot of training, a lot of resources. And basically, we've stopped doing that the last couple of years because of fires, floods, pandemics, more floods, and everybody thinks that they deserve to have an ADF helicopter come and rescue them, and some Australian soldier come to put sandbags in front of their house. And we forget this is a tiny defence force. It's a fraction of the size of the defence force of our neighbours, apart from New Zealand and the Pacific, obviously. But it's literally a very small fraction of the size of the Indonesian forces, and it's considerably smaller in land power terms compared to Singapore, a tiny island state. So we're having ourselves on, and I think I might have mentioned before, at the height of the Second World War in January 1943, out of a nation of 8 million, we generated 14 divisions of combat troops, about 10,000 people per division. We had 14 of them. Today, we have one regular force division and one reserve one, a hollowed out reserve division. We're kidding ourselves, and we keep thinking, we're not saying, we're patting ourselves on the back that we're going to grow the Defence Force by 18,000 in 18 years. It's like, you're kidding me, right? This is just not going to cut it. If the crises we're talking about start happening concurrently and start growing in ferocity, in frequency, and in scale, we are this almost broken, almost stretched out Defence Force where people are resigning because their families are a jack of not seeing them, is going to break. And we are, I've been appealing for some time now, Maria, for us to generate an Australian universal scheme for national and community service. And it's high time we do it. And that's not just for the Army, it's not just for the Navy and Air Force, it's for state and federal police, it's for the SES, the Rural Fire Service, the ambulance services, national parks, and so on. This is something that it's a difficult nettle to grasp because it's trans-jurisdictional. The states have some provenance here, the federal government has others, no one owns it, but the nation has to deal with it. And unfortunately, the national cabinet system hasn't yet delivered a visionary long-term approach to managing the nation's problems. And those problems are not shrinking, they're growing. And if anything, we're not thinking enough intergenerationally about the needs of our children and grandchildren. And that's got to start happening. And I think a national and community service scheme could well be a very significant inflection point in terms of helping us get there.
And Maria, look, I'd make the point that my last job in the Army was effectively the person responsible for training the force to be ready for the contingencies that it faced, and that's a full-time job. The performance of the Russian military, we're all sitting very arrogantly back in the West and critiquing their bumbling performance, their lack of coordination between their tanks and their infantry, the lack of coordination of their air defense systems and their helicopters. That's what militaries have to train really hard to do. And we have the incredible privilege of an all volunteer defence force. When it is able to train, can be the equal of any in the world, albeit very small. But if the force has been smeared across the country, at one end fighting fires, and now the people of Lismore expecting that the men and women of the ADF clean up the rubbish in their streets, I think we've got a distorted view of what is possible with the small defence force. And unfortunately, the federal government have limited action arms. They drive predominantly policy shops in their departments in Canberra. Well, one of their action arms is the Australian Defence Force. You can't keep pulling that lever though, because that machine will break. And as John said, we have record levels of separation in the Army in particular, because they are tired, and it's hard work in the middle of a COVID pandemic as well. So again, we as a nation, we have to sit back and analyse the implications of these things. Growing the Defence Force is a legitimate response, albeit we've got to now prove that we can do it. But I think, John and others are talking about other ways that kids and young people may want to serve their country. And I completely respect that not everybody will want to or is suited to serving in their military. So these are important conversations we have to have a nation. We're not going to solve it in one-off discussions. But if we who are civil society have to, develop a conversation that leads to decision-making along these lines.
And on that line, diplomacy is obviously critical, and the work that's being done in relation to AUKUS and also the Quad is important, and all the regional tie-ups. Are we doing enough in that space, John? Is our focus as sharp as it should be, or is there room to improve?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear me say, Maria, that I think there's plenty of room to improve. And one of the things that worries me is that there is a predilection towards Anglospheric comfort zone connections. Look, and my PhD is about Canada-Australia relations. I get the Anglosphere. I'm a fan of the Anglosphere, but I'm also a fan of regional engagement. It's so important for us to understand and build relationships and understanding and networks with our neighbours in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific. And we have really been ham-fisted on that front. We have very few people who speak and know and understand the language and the people of Indonesia. Similarly, in the Pacific, we're light on. We're very light on in that space. And our, as much as we may sense we are, North Atlantic transplantees, we live in the Indo-Pacific, off the edge of Asia. We have to get our heads around where we live. We have to reconcile the dialectic of our geography and our history. And that means AUKUS, and it also means ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum and our relations with Solomons, with PNG, with New Zealand, with Fiji, with Timor, with Indonesia, the F5 power defense ties with Malaysia and Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, and beyond. They're all important to us, and yet we are not sufficiently invested in that space. Just even economically, we have historically found it easier to just get one handler and one interpreter to go and do a loop around China, sign a few trade deals, and come back home for some tea and biscuits, right? That's not cutting it anymore. We're already butting up against the limits of that with the wolf warrior diplomacy and the sharp power exercise by President Xi. We've got a range of free trade agreements, to credit to both sides of Parliament, but particularly the Conservatives for their work on the free trade agreements in recent years. We've got some great free trade agreements with our neighbours that we need to now capitalise on, and capitalise on this, not just in terms of trade, education, security ties, people-to-people ties, etc. That, the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, which I call Australia's Plan B, spoke well to these points. We actually need to reread that document and think about applying it, because it's got some really great points in there about building relations with our neighbours. Yes, AUKUS is great. Yes, OSMIN is important. Yes, our alliance with the United States is good. These are good things. Yes, the Quad is useful, but let's not put all our eggs in those baskets. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's not Quad or our ties with ASEAN partners or our ties with Pacific Island Forum partners. It's plus. It's got to be. But as I say, we're in a place where we're predisposed to go where we're comfortable. People who look like us and speak English a bit like us, and we're comfortable there. And it's intellectually, if not physically, lazy. And we've got to get ourselves out of that torpor and actually rise to the occasion, see what the gravity of the challenges, see how big our opportunities are, as well as the risks. Thanks,
Maria. I think this topic starts to draw together a couple of things we've talked about. Why is Ukraine important in Australia? I mean, clearly the suffering of the people of Ukraine is a global issue. But, when the General Assembly met recently to condemn Ukraine, 141 countries voted to condemn the actions of Russia. But significantly, more than half the population was resident in those 20 odd countries that chose not to sanction Russia, and that included both China and India. So to not understand the dynamic that leads to that kind of action shows the sort of arrogance that John is talking about. India is an incredibly important country to Australia. The Quad is an achievement in itself. I mean, I spent, more than 10 years of my career patiently, working as part of a leadership group trying to bring, India off the non-aligned bench and into the Quad. But what we know of them, their economic system, including cheap energy resources, their military is largely equipped from Russia. Things like the source codes for air defense, radars, etc., all come from Russia and will be turned off very quickly. So we have to understand these things. And I think perhaps even more important than India is Indonesia. And while they did vote to condemn President Putin's actions, they are very wary of the fickle nature of the West and long-term calm strategic policy backed up by diplomatic actions across both sides of politics in both the US and Australia are critical to maintaining the confidence of countries like Indonesia. So these are things that we've got to bring into educating our young people, our workforce. We've got to study more in universities and so that we are equipped to deal with this kind of emerging nuances. As John said earlier, the twilight period of a unipolar world where we had 40 or 50 or more years of relative peace and security, the world has changed, and we are now in a period where globalization will be challenged, countries will need to be more resilient, and the world may well break up into both technical and ideological blocks. So, the Chinese aspiration to run technical systems like 5G, to have their own banking and finance distribution systems, it's possible we may see the world break into those blocks. These are things we have to understand, prepare our young people for, and grow the workforce ready to respond to those challenges.
Well, I think that's a fabulous place to stop. John, if you wanted to make some final remarks, you'd be more than welcome. But we set out to answer the question, that the game has changed and who's writing the new rules. And it's clear that they are being written and we need to become far more familiar with them and more active in engaging. John.
So thank you, Maria. Look, one of the things about the democracy, it's the worst form of government apart from all the others, Winston Churchill once said, and there is some truth to that. It's dysfunctional, it's rambunctious, but one of the problems with it is it's very short-sighted. It's dealing with the next election, it's dealing with the tyranny of the urgent, and what we actually need is our political leaders to start looking intergenerationally at the challenges we face as a nation and thinking beyond just the next electoral cycle. And the point scoring that they can achieve on the floor of Parliament. We really do need to see some visionary leadership for the nation, pulling together states, territories, federal governments, industry, academia, commerce, diplomacy, the full spectrum of national power. Morgenthau listed a whole range of them. I've just touched on several of them there. But we have to be mindful that the world is in flux. Australia's dominant position in this part of the world is up for debate. We are being eclipsed economically by our neighbours, and we are being challenged on a security front and on a range of issues philosophically about how we view the world. The idea of an open society that Karl Popper wrote about so effectively at the start of the Cold War, his writing remains incredibly relevant. The open society and its enemies, and there are numerous enemies of open societies out there. They include corrupt kleptocratic regimes hiding from the truth and looking to exploit great power opportunism to benefit themselves. I suspect we're seeing a bit of that in the Solomon Islands at the moment. But we need this kind of thinking beyond ourselves, beyond our own little jurisdictions, and beyond our own political cycles.
Thank you, John. Gus, did you want to make some final points? You're fine. Thank you, gentlemen. This has been a remarkable conversation, and if anything, what it shows is the interrelationship between the economy, between society, between diplomacy, and of course security, and the need for leadership. We have a great agenda ahead of us, and let's hope that this conversation stimulates action, because that's what we're all about. Thank you again for your time.